Okay, so you know how we like to do these deep dives, right? Taking what you send us and really pulling out the core ideas.
Yeah, trying to make sense of it all without, getting lost in the weeds.
Exactly. And this time you guys send in something that's really fascinating and thought-provoking, an essay called Unsolvable by Design.
Living the three-body problem.
Right, Living the Three-Body Problem. And it's by Jaime Hoerricks, PhD. And what grabbed me right away was the title itself.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Ah.
It's using this really complex physics concept, the three-body problem, as a metaphor.
And a really powerful one at that for understanding the complexities of living with autism, transness, and chronic illness.
It's interesting because Hoerricks has a background that you wouldn't necessarily expect a PhD who kind of stumbled into astrophysics after a football injury.
Wow, what a path.
Right. But they found this profound connection between these intricate physical systems and their own life experiences.
I love that. So at its heart, this essay argues that life isn't always a simple orbit around a single sun.
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes there are these multiple powerful forces pulling you in different directions.
Making the outcome a lot less predictable.
Exactly. And to really get this idea, Hoerricks starts by taking us back to some basic physics.
Okay, so let's break it down, starting with the two-body problem. What's that all about?
Okay, so imagine one object like the Earth orbiting a much larger object like the Sun.
Got it. Classic planetary motion.
Exactly. And the key here is that this system is stable and predictable. The math works out.
So we can map the orbit and know where the Earth will be?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Even if you add another planet, it gets a bit more complicated, but you can still generally solve it.
So two bodies, understandable interactions, foreseeable paths.
Precisely.
But then what happens when we throw in a third body into the mix?
Well, that's where things get really interesting and really complicated. It becomes what we call the three-body problem.
Okay, I'm sensing a but here.
Yeah, because with that third gravitational force, suddenly there's no easy way to predict where any of the objects will go in the long run.
No way to predict it, even if we know exactly where they started.
Right. Even with super precise initial data, the system becomes chaotic and unpredictable.
So it's like the butterfly effect, but on a cosmic scale.
Any tiny change in the beginning can lead to wildly different outcomes later on.
So there's no one equation that can explain it all.
Not really. We can run simulations and sometimes find stable configurations, but there's no universal solution.
Wow, so that's a pretty powerful metaphor for life, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's exactly what Hoerricks is getting at. Living with these interconnected identities is kind of like navigating a three-body system. It's inherently unpredictable and defies simple solutions.
I like that a lot. Okay, so let's dive into the first of these personal orbits that Hoerricks describes autism as a complex system.
Right. And from the get-go, they challenge those one-dimensional views of autism, the ones that treat it as a single isolated thing.
Like it's just one planet orbiting a star.
Yeah, instead, Hoerricks presents autism as its own intricate gravitational system with all these interacting elements.
Okay, so what are some of those elements that make up this system?
Well, one of the things they talk about is Gestalt language processing, or GLP. Did that jump out at you at all?
Oh, yeah, totally. The way they describe it is fascinating, this idea that language comes in these whole chunks, full of meaning and emotion.
Like catching a comet.
Yes, exactly. It's not built up word by word like building blocks. It takes time for those whole phrases to sink in and become part of their vocabulary.
Right, and it can be a much slower process for some autistic folks to integrate those phrases.
Which makes total sense. And then there's alexithymia, which is the difficulty in identifying and describing emotions.
And Hoerricks describes it so beautifully, saying it's like feeling the movement of an emotion, but without having the words, the coordinates to name it.
It's like you can sense there's this internal activity, but you can't pinpoint it exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's this seemingly paradoxical experience of hyper-empathy, this intense absorption of other people's emotions.
So it's like feeling the gravitational pull of someone else's feelings so strongly while struggling to understand your own.
It's like a double whammy, right?
Yeah.
And it highlights how these different aspects of being autistic aren't separate things.
They're all tangled up, interacting in this complex and sometimes unpredictable way, creating a unique personal orbit.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving on to orbit 2, we have transness as a planet with a shifting trajectory.
And here Hoerricks introduces this idea that gender is not a fixed point of reference. It's a planet that doesn't stay where it was meant to.
And for them, that initial force that disrupted their expected orbit was the experience of queerness.
Right. It revealed that there were other possibilities beyond those traditional circular paths.
And then hormone replacement therapy, or HRT, came along, and Hoerricks describes it in these incredibly powerful terms as a detonation, a planetary event.
Not just a gradual shift, but a fundamental reshaping of their gendered reality, moving from ambiguity to clarity.
Yeah, and this shift also recontextualized their understanding of their queerness, revealing a star within what was once just a nebula.
It's such a powerful image. And they emphasize how important it was to unlearn all those societal models that had misnamed their gender.
Because those cultural assumptions can really warp our understanding of gender, pushing us into those rigid binary boxes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And being trans isn't just about an internal sense of self. It also affects how others perceive you.
And when you combine that with being autistic, those perceptions can become even more distorted,
Right. People might misinterpret certain behaviors or sensory responses,
leading to all sorts of misunderstandings. And that's where the concept of neuroqueerness comes in.
which for Hoerricks isn't so much a third separate identity, but more like a recognition of this fundamental interconnectedness.
It's a refusal to separate the neurological and the political, the way they process the world and their gender identity.
Yeah, it's about embracing those complex spaces between the established models and rejecting those neat and tidy categories.
I like that a lot. Okay, so now we come to Orbit 3, chronic illness, as an erratic and disruptive force.
And this is where we really see the introduction of an unpredictable element, something less like a stable planet and more like
rogue asteroid.
exactly right. Chronic illness is that third body with a diffuse and shifting presence, and often without even the language or recognition to understand it early on.
Yeah, Hoerricks talks about their own early experiences with pain, that feeling of being off axis, but not having the words to explain it.
And that lack of understanding often led to dismissals from people who just offered those simplistic, unhelpful advice.
Right, like just try this or think positive.
Exactly. And then they were eventually diagnosed with erythromelalgia or man-on-fire syndrome.
Which really highlights the unpredictable nature of these flare-ups, triggered by seemingly random things like changes in temperature.
And the way they describe this pain is so powerful, not just as a physical sensation, but as a disruption of rhythm.
It messes with your sense of time, your ability to focus your thoughts. It pulls you out of alignment with the world's expectations.
The body itself becomes this sometimes hostile planet, disrupting those moments of clarity.
It's so frustrating to think about how many people go through that without the language or validation to understand their own experiences.
Absolutely. And the thing about chronic illness is that it's often invisible to others.
So it can lead to disbelief and this erosion of credibility.
Yeah, and that can impact how their other identities are perceived.
So instead of being seen as a trans person experiencing pain or an autistic person experiencing pain, they might just be seen as unreliable or flaky.
Exactly.
Okay, so with these three orbits laid out, Hoerricks circles back to the astrophysics metaphor and critiques those two body models that try to understand their life.
Right, because their life is shaped by these multiple interacting forces. It's not just one problem with one solution.
And they bring up a really stark example, the appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. with his history of promoting misinformation about autism.
And that example illustrates the danger of applying that simplistic two-body model in a literal way,
Like trying to eliminate the second body of autism altogether.
which is obviously incredibly harmful and misguided.
And it also highlights how inadequate the medical model can be with its assumption of a singular normal.
Right, with the goal of fixing, clarifying, or managing each of these identities in isolation.
As if they were separate planets that could be nudged back into their proper orbit.
Exactly. But Hoerricks argues that they and others with similar experiences are not anomalies,
They represent patterns that our current models just can't process.
and these identities aren't new. They've always existed.
So this idea that they're caused by something modern is just not accurate.
Right. And the desire to cure or align these identities with a flawed model is dangerous.
Because that model was built to exclude these experiences in the first place.
Precisely. Stability is not the default in a three-body system.
And Hoerricks represents a different kind of orbit, not a malfunction.
Exactly.
And that leads us to this concept of living in the chaotic zone and resisting legibility.
Which paints such a vivid picture of what it's like to live in a world where stable trajectories are rare and predictions fail.
It's a life experienced in fragments and elliptical patterns and through the constant interference of these multiple forces.
And this clashes so hard with the demands of a capitalist society that values legibility, productivity, and predictability.
Because none of those things come easily when you're navigating these complex realities.
Right. Their emotional states, their energy levels, their gender expression, their physical reliability, their thought patterns.
None of it fits neatly into those boxes, and that often leads to social, economic, and structural disadvantages.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I found it fascinating how they connected their experience to those early Soviet thinkers like Vygotsky and even the ternary Situn computer.
Yeah, what was that all about?
Well, it seemed to be about the resistance of these more nuanced, non-binary ways of understanding the world to the dominant capitalist framework.
Because capitalism often thrives on simplified inputs and outputs, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just as ternary logic, with its true, false, and indeterminate states, doesn't fit easily into a binary system.
These more complex understandings of human experience resist easy categorization.
And so those living in the chaotic zone often develop their own unique ways of navigating the world.
Using tools like poetry, sensory awareness, and metaphor to make sense of things.
It's not a rejection of reason, but maybe a different kind of reason.
And there's this shift away from constantly trying to force resolution.
Instead, recognizing those moments of alignment and stability as gifts.
Not permanent solutions.
Right, and there's this underlying realization that they were never meant to fit perfectly into the existing system.
And that very illegibility, that resistance to being easily defined, can be a form of resistance in itself.
It's a powerful way of looking at it.
So in their final reflections, Hoerricks brings that central metaphor full circle, emphasizing the importance of understanding these interconnected identities through the lens of the three-body problem.
Yeah, they're done with those simplistic awareness campaigns and those reductionist two-body models.
Because those models just can't capture the full picture.
And it's important to remember that this essay comes from a place of lived experience.
It's not just an academic exercise. It's an act of truth-telling and self-affirmation.
Absolutely, and the core message really sticks with you.
Individuals with these interconnected identities are not problems to be solved.
They're not anomalies to be corrected or interferences to be eliminated.
They're fundamental and inherent complexities within the human experience.
And that final line they leave us with is so thought-provoking. We are the maths you haven't learned yet.
It really challenges us to rethink our understanding of these experiences and acknowledge the limits of our current models.
Maybe what seems unsolvable isn't a puzzle to be cracked,
but a reality to be witnessed and understood on its own terms.
Yeah, and that's something worth pondering.
Absolutely. It definitely gives us a lot to think about.
For sure.
Thanks for diving in with us today.
You bet.